If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales, and master detective novels.
I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
On today's episode, Valerie pitched Sense and Sensibility so that we can study beginnings and endings. This 1995 film was directed by Ang Lee from an Oscar-winning screenplay by Emma Thompson, based on Jane Austen's novel. Of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie. And we have a favour to ask. We'd love it if you could give the show a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page, scroll down to the bottom, and hit the stars. It's that simple. All right, Valerie, what have you got for us this week with the genre of Sense and Sensibility?
Well, I think that the global genre is a courtship love story, and the secondary genre I'm calling a worldview maturation. And I think that's for Marianne, because I don't think Eleanor really changes all that much. What did you get?
Yeah, that's a good point. I had the same. So I had for the global genre a romance courtship movie, and then for the secondary genre, worldview and maturation. And I agree with you. I think Mary Ann's arc is actually far greater than Eleanor's.
Alrighty, so let's get on to the topic of discussion for this week. So far this season, I have introduced 2 ideas with respect to beginnings and endings. So the first idea is that a story is about how one thing changes. The beginning and the end of a story show the thing, the topic of the story, at its 2 extremes, before the change and after the change. And the second idea is that the opening scene and the closing scene rhyme in some way. And this is what Stephen Pressfield calls the in and the out. There are 3 things we need to keep in mind about the in and the out, and they are, 1, that the opening and closing images of a story should look as alike as reasonably possible. 2, at the same time, the out should be as different as possible from the in emotional and narrative terms. And 3, both the in and the out need to be on theme. So, with respect to Sense and Sensibility, where does that leave us? Well, let's look at the thing that's changing first. The very first thing to notice about this movie is that there are multiple storylines. This automatically makes it a more advanced form of storytelling. Whenever you have multiple plots or subplots or multiple points of view or a nonlinear story form, you're increasing the degree of writing difficulty. Now, I'm not suggesting that you can't or you shouldn't do that. I'm simply pointing it out so that you know what it is you're getting yourself into. Forewarned is forearmed. So with that in mind, at its highest level, this story is about the fate of the Dashwood women. The central dramatic question, or the main question that the readers and the viewers want an answer to is, will these women be okay? And this is dramatized through the love stories of Eleanor and Marianne, because if one of them can marry well, the audience knows that Mrs. Dashwood and all her daughters will be safe. So with respect to the love stories, the dramatic questions are, how will Eleanor and Edward come together? How will Marianne realize that Brandon is the man for her? Because these are both romances, the happily ever after is baked in. We know the girls will live happily ever after. The only question is how. So the main love story is between Eleanor and Edward because Eleanor is the primary protagonist. Marianne is the secondary protagonist. So her love triangle, the Marianne Willoughby Brandon love triangle, that's the secondary love story. Structurally, the way this film has been set up, It's Eleanor's love story that frames the whole narrative. Eleanor's romance with Edward is introduced and dashed in the beginning hook. The middle build is occupied primarily with Marianne's love story. This is where she meets both Brandon and Willoughby, although there is a notable and important complication to Eleanor's love story in the form of Lucy Steele. Now, both love stories resolve in the ending payoff. First Marianne's and then Eleanor's. So structurally speaking, Marianne's love story is contained entirely within Eleanor's. It starts after Eleanor's and it resolves before Eleanor's. Sense and Sensibility, therefore, is about the fate of the Dashwood women. They're destitute at the beginning and financially secure at the end. The means to their financial security is through the marriages of the two Dashwood daughters. Eleanor and Marianne are single, and without prospects, I might add, at the beginning, but they're both happily married to men they love at the end. Because Marianne marries Colonel Brandon, who's quite wealthy, everyone is safe. He has provided a living for Edward, which by extension means that Eleanor is safe. And he's such a good and respected man that he will, of course, ensure that Mrs. Dashwood and Margaret are well cared for. And when the time comes, he'll make sure that Margaret marries well. And for what it's worth, the beginning hook is, by my calculation, 27 and a half minutes long, and the ending payoff is 28 and a half minutes long. Again, not a coincidence. All right, let's look at the in and the out. And this is the concept from Stephen Pressfield. We said that the opening image is repeated at the end, and we saw an example of that last week in the Bourne Identity when we had the image of the water being repeated. So in Sense and Sensibility, the opening scene is the death of Mr. Dashwood. The ending scene is the double wedding for Eleanor and Edward and Marianne and Brandon. So that's definitely not a repeating image. So, what the heck, right? What's going on here? Well, remember that Stephen Pressfield said that in films, there's a repetition of a visual image, but in novels, the repetition can be on the level of mood, voice, interior monologue, philosophical statement, or idea. Now, when I first heard this, I wondered if perhaps the repetition for films could also include mood, voice, interior monologue, philosophical statement, or idea. Likewise, I wondered if novels could repeat a visual image. In other words, we have this list of possible options for a repetition. And I'm wondering if they're as specific to the medium as Pressfield says, or if it's more fluid than that, especially when we're dealing with a film that is an adaptation of a novel. My instinct is telling me that it can be fluid. I mean, honestly, I cannot think of a reason why it wouldn't work. But I have not yet done enough research to really give a definitive answer. So right now, I just want to mention it here so that you can keep an eye out as you're doing your own research. And if you make any interesting discoveries, I would love to hear them. Reach out to me on Twitter or Instagram at Valerie_Francis and let me know what you learned. Okay, so in Sense and Sensibility, how is this ending of a marriage a repetition of the beginning, which is a death scene? What the heck? Well, I think the idea of family and familial love is being repeated. Stay with me here. I'm going out on a limb. So just see what you think of this. Mr. Dashwood's dying wish is that his wife and daughters are cared for. He loves all four of his children, and he is happy that John and Fanny will be cared for, but he wants the women to be looked after as well. In the end, we have two new families forming, Eleanor and Edward, Marianne and Brandon, and they will care for Margaret and Mrs. Dashwood. We also have the repetition of promises that are specifically about the family unit. So in the beginning, John promises his father that he'll look after his stepmother and sisters. He breaks that promise, though, and of course, that's the inciting incident of the whole story. Now, in the end, we have two couples making promises to one another, too. And these are among the most important promises that it's possible for any of us to make. They're so elevated in their importance that they have their very own name. It's not just a basic promise, it's a vow. A vow is a promise related to a new family unit. The opening promise, John's promise to his father, is weaker and it's easily broken. The ending promise, the marriage vow, is much stronger. It's not simply one man giving another man his word in private. The marriage vows are given in public, and they're to honor and love one another. So a vow carries more weight than a simple promise. And it's doubled because there are two weddings. And then there's the circle of life. In the beginning, we have a death, Mr. Dashwood. In the end, we have the anticipation of birth. Because in a period piece like this, it's expected that Eleanor and Marianne will eventually have children. Mr. Dashwood's death is an ending. The marriages are a beginning. One life ends, 4 new lives begin. So, no, there isn't a literal repetition of an image like we saw with the water in the Born Identity, but it is a repetition of theme and of ideas. So, Melanie, how did you get on with your study of sequences this week?
Well, that's a very interesting question because breaking this story down into sequences was more difficult for me than the Born Identity because the action or climactic moment for each sequences were more difficult to determine. So my first cut was wildly unbalanced. I had some sequences that were over 30 minutes and others that were under 7 minutes. And the reason this happened was because I focused on one storyline instead of the thematic storyline. So instead of looking solely at Eleanor's story, I needed to look at Eleanor and Mary Ann's story as two parts of the whole, which aligns, I think, Valerie, with what you were saying in your section at the front. It is the fate of the Dashwood women that the story is about. So that makes sense. I did nominate Eleanor as the protagonist in the story because it's her love story we're introduced to first. However, Mary Ann's story is a very close second. In fact, it was the fate of both sisters linked to Mary Ann's story, and when they align, that is what I used to determine my sequence breaks this week. Now, again, I've used a single central action to summarize the sequences, so I'm going to list those out. So sequence 1, I think, is the Dashwoods need a home. Sequence 2 is Edward and Eleanor's doomed courtship. Sequence 3 was Meet Sir John and the Neighbours. I've got sequence 4, which is based around Mary Ann's suitors. Sequence 5, which is after the midpoint shift, is I've called To London to Find the Men. And then sequence 6 is The Sisters Are Broken-Hearted. Then in the ending payoff, or the third act, I've got sequence 7, which is Facing a Life Without Love. And then finally sequence 8, which I've called Love is Patient and Kind. So what I've noticed this season as I'm looking at sequences, noting that we're only 3 episodes in so far, but the thing I've noticed is that the movies we've watched have very strong, clearly defined characters with clear roles. And the story doesn't divert from the theme. So the threads or subplots are on theme and don't shift attention away from the primary story. So they are variations of the global genre. So I'm sure you've noticed that I've used the word threads a few times when I'm really probably discussing subplots. But to me, threads are a better way to describe subplots because when I'm writing and when I'm analysing story, I think of how a story is woven and how the threads have woven together to create the fabric of the story. And this is an image that works for me. So I'm using that language to describe to you how I'm viewing the story and how I'm breaking it down and seeing it. So breaking down the story in sequences and looking at how each character and thread is woven has highlighted another important storytelling convention. So this has really reinforced a point that Valerie made last season during the Matrix episode, and that's stating the hope, fear, and stakes that the story is about out loud. Now, in Sense and Sensibility, Marianne summarizes the stakes of the movie for her after her mother receives a letter offering them Barton Cottage. Mrs. Dashwood wants to delay telling Eleanor about the offer because of the attachment forming between Eleanor and Edward. Marianne, who is not enthusiastic about Edward, says, "Can he love her? Can the soul really be satisfied with polite affections? To love is to burn." It's not out of place in the dialogue of the story, and it sums up Marianne's character and why she makes certain choices. The summary sentence is a convention in movies, and it's one that could be used to greater effect in novels as well. Now, back to sequences. So the first 4 sequences present different fates for the sisters. Eleanor and Edward's love is thwarted at the end of Act 1, and hope of seeing Edward away from Fanny seems to be dashed in sequence 3, when Edward mails the atlas he promised to bring himself. Marianne's love story has not started at the end of Act 1, so the large climactic moment and Mrs. Dashwood's decision to move to Barton College is based on Fanny's comment about marrying below what her mother expects, and that's in relation to Edward's marriage. The lovers are separated twice over because Edward is also called away to London, where Eleanor is moving to Barton Cottage. Eleanor's love story is presented first and resolved last. After the first 2 sequences, it's not directly on the screen again until the second part of the movie, once Mrs. Jennings takes the party to London for the season. Now, each pair of sequences has a job to do in the story, and this week I'm going to focus on sequence 1 and 2 and sequences 3 and 4. Now, these are not hard and fast rules, but they are options for you to consider as you write or edit your story when you're thinking about it in terms of sequences. So there are some scenes we should see in the first 2 sequences, and these are meeting the protagonist, or in this case, the protagonist being Eleanor and Marianne. We see their ordinary world, so the Norland estate is large and has a modest number of servants who work for Mrs. Dashwood. So we must also understand the internal and external problems. The Dashwoods must find a new home, and their situation has limited Eleanor's prospects of marrying for love. We don't see Marianne's problems other than her fate rests with her family. We see the protagonist's special skill. So this is the hero's gift expressed, which Valerie discussed a lot last season. So Eleanor's gift is guiding the family's decisions on where to live and being practical about the constraints their allowances place on them. And we see that she's very sensible. We meet the antagonist. So Fanny is the Dashwoods' antagonist because she's the one who's manipulated her husband into giving them nothing despite Mr. Dashwood's wishes on his deathbed. Fanny is also Eleanor's antagonist in love. She conspires a number of times to keep Edward and Eleanor separated. We also must meet the love interest, and this is Edward. Eleanor's affection for Edward comes at the end of the first sequence and is the main action of the second sequence. And the Act 1 crisis, as I've already mentioned, is when the Dashwoods leave for Barton College and Edward leaves for London with no promises or commitments to Eleanor. Each of the sequences in the stories we've watched so far have some similar features. In season 1, we've met the protagonists, seen their usual world and understand their wants and needs, their problems, and we've also seen their special skills. So in sequences 3 and 4, we are now moving into the first half of the second act. We start looking for different things. We start to see the ladies picking up new allies. So we're introduced to Sir John, Mrs. Jennings and Colonel Brandon, all of whom work to manoeuvre Marianne and Eleanor into the path of eligible men. So these people are all on the Dashwoods' side. We meet a love interest, so Marianne meets Willoughby and falls head over heels in love with him. We must see or can see the protagonist winning. Now, this is really interesting. Marianne is winning as the courtship with Willoughby moves at lightning pace, but Eleanor's love story is not winning in this first half of Act 2. We must also see an attack by the antagonist. So Edward is kept away from Barton Cottage, and the climactic moment in sequence 4 is when Willoughby is kept from proposing to Marianne. So we see two antagonists even though they're not entirely on screen, but we see the repercussions of the antagonist's actions even if we don't fully understand them. We kind of get an idea that something is amiss. And there must also be the start of a series of tests. So Marianne's actions with Willoughby test Eleanor, who believes her sister is acting with impropriety and their outward displays of affection are not appropriate. Now, one of the most important aspects of sequences 3 and 4 is that they must deliver on the promise of the genre. And since this is a love story, sequences 3 and 4 are focused on 3 love stories: the failure of Eleanor and Edward, Colonel Brandon's unrequited love for Mary Ann, and the courtship between Mary Ann and Willoughby. For nearly every scene is focused on one aspect of these love stories in this 3rd and 4th sequence. These plot lines for Eleanor's story work in concert with Mary Ann's story. Eleanor's pain when the Atlas arrives is secondary in a plot sense to Mary Ann's joy at meeting Willoughby. And there's also Colonel Brandon's sad acceptance of Mary Ann's rejection, but also his admiration for her joie de vivre. Now, I mentioned that one of the problems I had was focusing on Eleanor's story instead of Eleanor and Mary Ann's story, and both are essential to help understanding the whole movie. Mary Ann is the sensibility part of the title, which means, in this sense and when it was written, a person who is driven primarily by their emotions. Mary Ann's fast affection for Willoughby catches fire fast, burns brightly, and turns to ashes in a much shorter period than Eleanor's. Mary Ann's Willoughby love story is included in sequence 3 to 6, but the Brandon love story starts, well, at least for Brandon, in sequence 3, and then goes on to finish at sequence 8. In the middle of the story, we see both sisters at a point where their requited love has become apparently unrequited. But things get worse for both through sequences 5 to 7. Mary Ann's is played out more publicly in society when she encounters Willoughby at the ball with his new fiancée, but Eleanor's is played out in private, and this is an interesting contrast, but also one that is keeping with the characters themselves and also the title of the story. Now, Eleanor's dilemma actually comes from three places. There's Fanny, who schemes to keep her and Edward apart, especially, and we see that also, we think, well, the machinations going on behind that when the Atlas arrives without Edward. So there's subtext there. So we assume that Edward is actually being kept away from joining the Dashwoods through some machinations with Fanny and Edward's mother. And then there's also Lucy. So Lucy confides to Eleanor that she's been secretly engaged to Edward for a number of years and swears Eleanor to secrecy. It's at this point where Eleanor's sense or her understanding of propriety and social conventions take a sharp turn. She must deny her own hurt and pain, and if what Lucy says is true, then Edward never held affection for her. So Eleanor is a pillar of sense and puts all others' welfare above her own. Now, the sequences in Sense and Sensibility are not as even as they were in The Bourne Identity. The final sequence is nearly 30 minutes long, whereas the other sequences are harder to identify, but I think they average out between 13 and 17 minutes. Now, like farce and dramatic irony in our first 2 episodes, this week's device has been to use 2 protagonists to create a whole story and subplots. This has been an unexpected delight this season, and I can't wait to see what next week's episode brings us in terms of how to use device to help you tell the story through your sequences. Now, next week, I'll focus on providing an analysis of the last 2 pairs of sequences and how the threads woven in the first part of the story continue into the second part. So that's my analysis of sense and sensibility in terms of sequences. Valerie, do you have any action steps for us this week?
I do indeed. What I would like you to do, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to look at the opening scene and the closing scene of your novel and ask yourself where the repetition is. Are you using a literal repetition or a thematic one? If you haven't included a repetition yet, how can you work one into your story?
Great. Well, that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we're discussing sliding doors. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For even more information about putting story theory into practice, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. And you can also now find her on TikTok at Valerie Francis Author, all one word. If you'd like to find more out about me, visit melaniehill.com.au or visit me on Facebook as Melanie Hill Author. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.